Hey guys, welcome back to As a Man Thinketh on Unjust TV. Let me introduce you to a couple people real quick.
We're Charles and Heather Maude. We own Maude Hog and Cattle in both Custer and Pennington counties in western South Dakota, where we raise cattle, hogs, small grain crops, and put up some hay. We also market our beef and pork direct to consumer, primarily through the Black Hills Farmers Market. Our family farm and ranch has been in Charles' family since 1907, and he is the fifth generation of his family to own and operate it. And we work really hard to provide the same lifestyle we were raised with to our children, who will be the sixth generation should they pursue production agriculture.
We owned land back in 1907 up the river here about 3 or 4 miles. Then later on in 1917, we homesteaded another piece. Like this home place here was added in 1948. And back in 2017, we added more pasture land, Heather and I did. We run both my great-grandparents and my great-great-grandparents' place up the river also at this time.
This is Charles and Heather Maude of Maude Hog and Cattle in South Dakota. Their fifth generation farm is located kind of northeast of Custer State Park and just northwest of the Badlands. So on or around June 20th, 2024, I think it was June 20th, 2024, was when the indictment was actually filed. Charles and Heather were arrested and indicted on charges of stealing federal land by the United States Forest Service. Here's what the indictment says. Beginning at a time unknown, so they didn't know when this started, but no later than December 2020, and continuing through the date of this indictment. So I think it's important to acknowledge that they don't know when this infringement occurred. Okay, but they know that starting in December of 2020, it was going on. So this is an officer who has been investigating this for several years. In the District of South Dakota, the defendants Charles Maude and Heather Maude did knowingly steal, purloin, which is another fancy word for stealing, and convert to their own use national grasslands managed by the United States Department of Agriculture, a department and agency of the United States, namely approximately 25 acres of national grasslands for cultivation and 25 acres of national grasslands for grazing cattle, or approximately, having a value in excess of $1,000, and did aid and abet each other, in all in violation of 18 USC 641, General Statute 641 and 2. Okay, so approximately, so they're not really sure how much land is involved here, and I don't want to get into the nitpickies of this indictment, but some of the key facts, though, I think with reading this indictment is that, you know, they mentioned specifically December 2020. They mentioned that they don't know how long this has been going on for, but this is when this person noticed that it was happening, and you know, how they can say that they willfully did something illegal. This is over a fence line dispute. We'll get into that in a second. I don't know, because they weren't observing it before December 2020. They just know that it was going on. And so basically you had armed tactical agents with their tactical gear on go in and arrest this couple in front of their kids and take them off for stealing government land. And like I said, this is over a disputed fence line.
I just wanted to point out there's these parcels of land in Custer County that I didn't look at before I record this video. And zooming in, it would appear as though there's about, I calculated 20 acres where this fence line dips just below into USDA. And I'm wondering if this could be the site of contention. Now that fence line looks like it's been there for quite some time. See how it drops at that angle right there? Okay, so and then there's this other area here right along the Cheyenne River where you have another, looks like 26 acres, assuming, you know, if there was a fence line coming through here or something where they have gone over their space a little bit. Charles, USDA. I mean, this gets confusing because the USDA just kind of pops up in random spots. So just to give you an idea, this section here, about 25 acres, and this is all owned by the Maudes. The Maudes actually own the land across here. this is all the Maude's land up here. And then they have a few parcels that are down into here, and the rest of their land is out over in here. So you have kind of a wide spread of land in here. And, you know, just a couple spots where there are some discrepancies of fence lines. This is probably the main one right here, though.
In a letter to U.S. Secretary of Agriculture Tom Vilsack, South Dakota Republican Senator Mike Rounds called the indictments of theft for government property served by the United States Forest Service Special Agent Travis Lunders while unannounced, armed, and in full tactical gear on Charles and Heather Maude of Caputa, South Dakota, an overzealous prosecution of a ranching family. According to the NCBA, which is National Cattlemen's Beef Association, according to the NCBA's Vice President Ethan Lane of Government Affairs, the Forest Service actions in this case, especially the deference they've given to a heavy-handed special agent with a long history of abusing permittees, is absolutely unconscionable. And what he's referring to when it comes to Travis is Travis does have a history this guy is really ambitious when it comes to prosecuting people. He had, and sometimes, you know, it could be justifiable. I don't know all of the cases. I mean, he's had people indicted. He's had private property taken by the United States government in some of his persecutions. So maybe it is, you know, I don't know. I'm not sitting on the jury on these things, but he does have a history of doing these types of things. In fact, he's really well known for Operation Timber Ridge. Operation Timber Ridge was a secret operation by the Forest Service to bust a timber company, you know, because taking timber off of forest land is bad, but it's allowed by the United States government. So they found somebody who had been injured on the job, and that person was complaining about, you know, their medical bills not being taken care of, and I mean, some workers' compensation issues, which are all bad things. If you don't take care of your workers when they're injured on a job, I mean, you're going to pay the price for it. But in that case, they ended up indicting over 11 people, mainly family members, and taking about $1 million worth of proceeds and equipment. It was a pretty big case for Travis. But Travis, from what I understand, from what I've read, from past cases, is a bit overzealous when it comes to prosecuting people. If Travis knocks on your door and wants to talk to you about something he has issues with, he's probably collecting evidence to indict you. He has absolutely, I mean, I'm just saying. But let's move on here, because a lot of this, you know, I'm going to try and leave my opinion out of it, and I'll explain to you why I don't necessarily have an overall opinion on this case in a minute. According to their GoFundMe page, and you know, this GoFundMe account has had very few donations. It's surprising. It's not even enough donations to cover, you know, half of the attorney's fees that Charles Maude has in a month, and that is based on an attorney who is a public servant. So he's actually had because Charles and Heather were both indicted separately, they both had to get separate attorneys to represent them in court. I mean, the financial obligation here is astounding. So, but according to their GoFundMe page, which is to help raise funds for their legal defense, it says the Maude family has owned the U.S. Forest Service allotment in question since the Forest Service came into existence, and has managed that same land since 1913. The family has never been advised it was violating any rules, and to this day, the family maintains its grazing agreement in good standing. The Public Lands Council, which represents landowners with the United States government, they do a fantastic job of making sure that people are being compliant with the rules of the U.S. government. You know, it's important that people aren't out there breaking rules, because the rights of grazing on public lands are not only detrimental to the taxpayer in managing those lands, because, you know, we're not having to pay for somebody to do it. We're letting somebody do it, and they're able to cover their costs because they're doing it with cows. It's also important to the industry and our food security. So the Public Land Council says that the Maude family are public lands permittees in good standing, and they have always been the first to step forward as constructive partners in federal land management. And most of the people that I know that do graze on federal lands work very, very closely with the Natural Resources Commission. They deeply respect our public lands and what they're doing. Now, I'm sure that's not everybody, but for the Public Lands Council to come out and back these guys and say, hey, look, these guys have always done things right. They've always been the first ones to come forward and say, okay, well, what can we do to change this? What can we do to work with each other here? So it doesn't sound to me like they have a background of being like, no, go screw yourself. The PLC president, Mark Ruber, says this case is a prime example of what can happen when federal agencies view ranchers as enemies rather than partners. I urge the U.S. Forest Service to rethink their plan to slap handcuffs on these working ranchers and instead pursue an alternative resolution to this issue. And there are a lot of alternative issues. And in fact, according to their GoFundMe website, when the U.S. Forest Service presented their concerns to Charles and Heather, they tried to meet with them and come up with different types of resolutions. And if they couldn't come up to a resolution, the next step is always civil court, right? You could go to civil court over these things. Then you get a court order, and the court basically decides, hey, yeah, you're not supposed to be using the land there, or actually, you guys are right, the fence is, in the wrong spot, or, whatever it might be. Hey, since this fence line has been here for so many decades, centuries, we're just going to accept a land swap. I mean, a court can make all of those decisions unless you're a service agent and that wasn't ever your intent. Because according to their GoFundMe page, after 2 meetings, the U.S. Forest Service stopped discussing amicable solution options, and within a couple weeks, they were indicted, which means that they were there to collect information on them. Now, some people may say that's entrapment, but I don't see how else you could explain that timeline. But they meet with the Forest Service. They say, hey, look, there's a dispute over this fence line. They say, okay, well, what can we do to fix this? They meet twice. The Forest Service gets the information they need. They indict them. The National Cattlemen's Beef Association president says this is a clear example of government overreach. I'm deeply disgusted by the Forest Service persecution of family ranchers Charles and Heather Maude. The Maude family has been ranching in South Dakota for 5 generations, and Charles and Heather have spent their lives protecting natural resources, investing in their land, and raising their children. The U.S. Forest Service and U.S. Attorney's Office have maliciously targeted and prosecuted these family ranchers, and it's clear that if this can happen in South Dakota, government overreach can happen anywhere, as we have seen everywhere lately. So give you a little bit of background. I kind of explained a little bit who Travis was. Travis is the special agent on this case. The South Dakota U.S. attorney was appointed. She's very young. She was appointed by the Biden administration. She's somebody who is very aggressive with her persecutions. I wouldn't want to get on her bad side. But what I find is that a lot of these people who move up a little too quickly in their careers do become a little overzealous at times. And I would argue that this case sounds to me like it's a bit overzealous. Now, there hasn't been any evidence produced on either side of the case yet. There hasn't been a counter argument because they don't have the evidence. It's taken months to get the state to, or the government, the feds, to produce the evidence. And it was a sealed indictment. So nobody really knows, what exactly the evidence is. There are, that's why I'm quoting so many people who are closer to the matter than I am, because I can't give you my full opinion on it without understanding completely what the fence line dispute is. Like I said, I looked at the maps.
What I actually think may be going on here, based on relationships that I know about with the Forest Service, is that this is an attempt to, and I'm not sure if they have any allotments tied with this land or not, but if they have allotments tied with this land, then I can tell you that it's an attempt to remove them access to those allotments. And if it's, this land is very attractive We'll put it that way. So if you hit somebody up with a very large fine, very attractive piece of land to certain people. So that's what I know about that area without giving specific details. And I doubt this has anything to do with it because South Dakota actually changed its eminent domain rules, which would make this rather difficult to complete. But you have, the railroad coming right through here, and some people didn't sell out. Apparently it was going to go right through here. There are multiple reasons why somebody who has interests in the same area as the Maudes would maybe want to get them in a little bit of trouble. Just saying.
So according to Lane, who's the NCBA's Vice President of Government Affairs, he says it didn't take us long to go through the paces to get to the bottom of what was happening in South Dakota. So he may know a little more than I do or any of us do about what's happening there. And that conversation was received in exactly the same kind of anger we received it when we took it to Capitol Hill. So what he's saying is they got to the bottom of what's going on, and when they took this to Capitol Hill, the people on Capitol Hill are just as angry about what's going on out in South Dakota as people in South Dakota are. And they started to talk to folks in the Natural Resources Committee. Chairman Representative Bruce Westerman, Republican of Arkansas, and his staff are acutely aware of this long history of abuse by the Forest Service in this part of the world. What is abuse? Well, abuse would be overzealous persecution of somebody. These bugs out here. We just had a hurricane, so this is really buggy. Should this have been a case, where in many ways, like I just said, I think that there may even be a case of entrapment here. You have a Forest Service coming to your door saying, hey, we found this fence line to be in the wrong place. Then you find out from this indictment that he's been investigating this since 2020. All he was doing was coming to them to get some sort of translation he could use as a confession or something out of their mouths to get the indictment that he was after. I mean, he wasn't there to negotiate anything with them. He wasn't there to just, even talk about, hey, you need to move the fence line. He was there for one purpose and one purpose only. That is an abuse of power, in my perspective. I think that this should have been discussed with them ahead of time. I think there should have been options before they used taxpayer funds to indict a couple and start some large criminal trial and try and put a father and a mother behind bars that may or may not have done anything intentional. This reminds me of a similar case in Idaho. I don't know if you guys heard about this one. But in Idaho, Greg and Lee Semple of Idaho, they carved out a homestead in Pokey Creek, and they had an organic farm there. And for years, they developed and built this farm, and it was all based on a fence line. I mean, they were there for 50 years before anybody said anything. It was all based on this old fence line with a timber company. Well, the timber company did a property swap with the United States government. The United States government came in 2018 and said, hey, this fence is in the wrong place and your organic gardens and some of your buildings are on our property. You need to move them and you need to pay a fine to us of God only knows how much money, over $100,000 or something, to remediate this land that we're going to timber anyway. And so this is a case that is ongoing in the state of Idaho. They've been fighting for their rights to the property. I think in this case, though, in the Idaho case, fence lines don't determine property lines, and I think that's also, in the case with the Maudes, is, we see this all over the place. I have a fence line on our property that is more inside my fence line than my property line. I know where my property line is. My neighbor has raised cows and grazed that part of our property. We've actually discussed the fact that the fence line is a little further in on my side than it is on their side. You could put a fence up wherever you want to on your property. It doesn't mean that that is the property line. But the fact that in Idaho, for example, it was assumed by both parties that the fence line was the property line until there was this property switch and the government came in with their schnazzy surveyors and determined that the government line was somewhere else. That creates a whole other set of parameters. I think if you went to the court and you argued that, there are some situations where they have actually determined that an assumed property line along a fence line was legal, you know, and they went with it. But it's a very hard case to make. Most of the time, a fence line is not considered. Well, in Oregon, I guess they do have structures on it, so that at least in the state of North Carolina, after 7 years, I mean, I would think that they would actually have rights to that property if nobody ever said anything to them. South Dakota, again, I'm not sure how that works, but I never considered a fence line a property line. I've always thought that you should have your property surveyed. I don't know what survey you go off of in South Dakota, whether it's, you know, because you have the property lines of the private property, you have the property lines of the U.S. government's property, and, you know, then you also have the Forest Service property, and you also have the Cheyenne River that runs through there. So there's a lot there as far as different borders, and different borders have different rules, right? Because the BLM allotment actually goes over part of their personal property as well. So, and again, this isn't coming from the Bureau of Land Management. This is something that's coming from the U.S. Forest Service. I don't know. It seems like there's a whole lot of complications that are mixed up in there. But I do know this. I know this. If you are a squatter in the United States for more than a few months, more than 30 days, you have rights in most of the states across this country. What I think is funny is that it's those same people who will handcuff you if you squat by mistake on public property. So whether they were in the right or in the wrong, and this is what I've been trying to think through on this, because I don't know all the facts, okay? I don't know if they deliberately put that fence line there knowing that they were putting that fence line there on government property, or if they put it there because they were going off of another map or a different allotment map, and they assumed that's where the property line was. What I do think is that if somebody does that, if a rancher or a farmer does that, especially somebody who you work with grazing rights to help maintain public lands, which is a service to the public people, going in and simply arresting them, going in, having a couple conversations with them to get evidence to indict them is wrong. You should be taking, you know, a civil action path. I would think that that would be the best route for the Forest Service in this case. Take a civil action path, and you may not win everything in civil court. In fact, you may not win everything in criminal court. But at least if you take this civil path, you can come up with a resolution through the court system that works for everybody. The problem is the Forest Service doesn't want to work with the court system. They don't. They'd rather work with the criminal system. They've got those people in their pockets. So instead, they've kind of gone this other route to work through the criminal court system. They've taken this ambitious, young United States attorney and said, hey, we're going to run with this. We're going to push criminal charges, and we're going to put another one of those on our belt buckle. That's what I think happened here. But again, I don't have all the evidence. And I think that in a case like this, the more it goes public, the more they should be compelled to put some information out there that at least says, hey, look, you know, this is what makes it criminal, okay? So far in their indictment, they didn't even prove that. They just said that since December 2020 and before that, we don't even know, which means that they don't know that it was even criminal intent that that fence was in the wrong place in the first place. I mean, think about it. They don't know when the trespass began. They just know that from December 2020, it was going on. And so they're pushing criminal charges against a couple saying that they did it deliberately. They deliberately took the land. They deliberately stole the land from the United States people. How do they know they did it deliberately? They don't even know when it started. So while I can't say, you know, and I don't think they can say at this point in time whether the mods did anything intentional or whether anything was done incorrectly or fraudulent, anything like that. I do think that there was probably a mistake made. I think it's more likely that there was a mistake made, and I think that they more or less would have done whatever it took to try and remedy that situation. But without all the facts, you know, I can't really say that or stand up for anybody in that regard. But I can say that it is definitely an overzealous reaction from the U.S. Forest Service, and they haven't been given much of a chance to fix the situation. You know, they had two meetings, which in my opinion were given to them just to collect evidence and throw them in jail. In my experience with South Dakota, and I've worked with Native American tribes in South Dakota, I've worked with private ranchers with allotments in South Dakota, I've worked with state parks in South Dakota. In my opinion, you know, a lot of the people that we have worked with are very considerate of each other, regardless of whether they're with conservation, indigenous groups, or private ranchers. But from the stories I hear of other people in South Dakota, you know, it's very much like a little bit of the Wild West. Sometimes you hear these stories and you think of the show Yellowstone. Well, that really does happen in real time. Not in South Dakota, but in other states. I have seen the sabotage of farmland in order to take it over. I have seen these things happening, and it is concerning to me. It's concerning to me that this is how we still choose to handle things. I think in this particular case that there's something bigger going on here. I think that there's somebody that is looking at the Maude saying, hey, this is a 5-generation ranch. What can we do to get rid of them? Oh, you see that fence line over there? I know we're talking about, you know, thousands of acres here, but they took 25 acres that belongs to you. Go arrest them. It's as simple as that. It's as crazy as that. 25 acres? What are you gonna do with 25 acres in that part of South Dakota? Put a cow-calf pair out on it? To say that it was deliberately done, to say that these people deliberately broke the law for the amount of acreage that, like I said, would feed a cow-calf pair is ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. I would be willing to bet this whole thing was a misunderstanding. And when they came to them and said, hey, this is wrong, they're probably looking at it like, okay, well, shoot, we have to move that entire fence line. Can't we just negotiate this, do a land swap or something? It's a reasonable response. Anyway, guys, until next time, keep your eyes open and pay attention to these things that are going on out there.